Will plays the peacock. The next morning, the carriage, provided by his lordship, was in the street in front of the bakery, waiting to carry Will to his new position in Bristol. He had donned his fine new clothes. He came into the dining room where everyone was still seated from breakfast and bowed deeply. "Everyone awed and awed. I feel like a bloody peacock," said Will with a scowl on his face. "And you look it too." His father laughed. They all laughed, including Will. Mei Li loaded the bags into the carriage. She was dressed in new clothes that she had sewn herself, patterned after the styles she had seen while in London, befitting a manservant. Her hair braided and put up under the hat, so no one would be able to tell she was not a man. New Lynn and Edward threw in their small bags and climbed aboard for the trip back to Bristol. 2 days later, Will arrived in his peacock clothes at the company office, accompanied by Mei Li. At the proper time, as befit his new station, he was directed to the office of Thomas Frost. Frost, because he was a junior investor, had been given as a reward the position of manager of the Bristol office. He welcomed Will with a sly smile. Will instinctively didn't like the little man who bent awkwardly forward from behind his desk to shake Will's hand. Will looked down his nose at the hand but didn't take it. The nails were dirty and quite long, and the fingers bony and gnarled. The oily hand was withdrawn with a scowl and gestured toward a high-backed chair. Will, playing the peacock, took his kerchief from his sleeve, dusted off the seat, and then sat straight-backed on the edge of the chair and continued to look down his nose at the man. Will then pulled from his coat his leather-bound book, and from it took the letter from his lordship which Will had been instructed to present upon his arrival. Will handed it to Mei Li, who stepped forward and handed it to Frost. Frost took the letter, opened it, and scowled at Will. Frost said with some surprise, "This says you are the appointed agent of the major stockholders, as well as taking the position of model shipwright, and that I am to allow you access to any part of the company's activities, records, or accounts. Lord BraitheWaite said nothing of this at our last meeting. I will have to discuss this with Daniels, my yard man, and Johnson, the accounts man." And he stood and left the room. He soon returned and said, "Well, I guess I will show you to your offices, and Daniels will be up shortly to take you to see the yards. The keel has been laid for both new ships, and the secondary timbers for the futtocks will be worked today." Will was ushered into his new office. It was a small, dingy room, quite dirty, with a well-used desk and one straight-back clerk's chair. Will gave him his best "you are lower than pond scum" look, and said to Frost in a loud voice, "This will just not do. It's filthy and has no window. I'll not be subject to the foul air here. I'll take offices elsewhere," and walked from the room. This had been planned, as they wanted offices that Frost and his cronies would not have easy access to either. Will said in a haughty voice, "I will tour the yards now. Where is your man, Daniels?" A large man with a reddish face and hair came into the offices and was introduced as Edward Daniels, yardman. Will and Mei Li accompanied the man down to the street. They boarded Will's carriage, which drove them a mere 200 yards down the street to an adjoining street and into an open yard where the ships were being built. "This way, sir," Daniels said, and directed them through the man door in a large double-gated entrance. 20 men were about the cutting of timber that would make up the framework of the ship. Daniels took Will into a small office and showed him the framing model used by the on-site shipwright to direct the carpenter, and said, "We cut the timber for the futtocks yesterday, and the men working the saw pits are cutting the lumber for the keelson and floor timbers." Will took out his small leather-bound book and scribbled a quick note about the discrepancy between what Frost said and what Daniels had just told him, and returned it to his vest. Will walked among the men and occasionally, making a note or two into his book. "All right, Daniels, I have seen enough. Tell Frost I am going to seek an office elsewhere and will contact him tomorrow about this time." He and Mei Li boarded the carriage and drove away, leaving a dumbstruck Daniels standing there with his hand on his hips, cursing. "That and Poppin' J, who the bloody H does he think he is?" Having arrived 2 days before the first Bristol meeting, Will knew exactly where they were going. Offices and a residence have already been selected, leased, and prepared for Will before his arrival. They drove indirectly to the residence and watched for followers. Mei Li had, upon arrival, been directed to find 2 men for a night detail to just watch the yards and report on everything they saw. She visited the local market for 2 days and began to cultivate an acquaintance of the fishmonger's wife. When Mei Lee told her of the need for 2 men for watchers, the old woman said she had 2 nephews, Joseph and Stanley, who could be trusted for such a job. Will and Mei Lee met the men at a public house and bought ale for the table and a meat pie. Will was not thrilled when the 2 men arrived. Joe was tall with straw-colored hair and buck teeth, and Stan was just the opposite, short and round as he was tall. Will told them that he wanted them to watch the shipyards night and day and follow any wagons leaving the yard and report on where they went. They assured him they wouldn't go to sleep on the job as they regularly spent most nights fishing and slept during the day. Will knew this meant they were smugglers of some type, but Joe assured Will he would do his job proper. The next morning, Joe and Stan were sitting in the kitchen eating a breakfast made for them by the new cook Will had hired for the house. He didn't want anyone seeing his manservant Mei Lee cooking and get any ideas. They told Will no wagons had come or gone from the yard during the night and wanted to know if he wanted them to continue to watch. Will asked why they had left the yard unwatched and come together to report. Before he could finish, Joe was waving his hands and said, "We'd not do that, sir. I got me kid brother watching days with orders to be following any wagon leavin'. We's got to sleep sometime." Stan agreed and bounced his head up and down at Joe's statement, his mouth too full of his breakfast to have said anything. Will wondered if the 2 had sent the kid brother to watch the night and gone smuggling. "We may need an inside man. Do you know anyone capable of getting a position as a sawyer or carpenter?" Will asked. "Not to mind right off, but I will ask Ma who can do that job," Joe replied. Will understood they were not allowed to do anything without the old lady's permission. These 2 didn't have a complete brain between them. Will made a great show arriving at the office and told Frost he wanted a daily written report on the progress of the carpenters. Frost protested that this was not within Will's authority, so Will again took out the letter from Lord BraitheWaite that appointed Will his representative as well as liaison between the company and the designers. When Frost protested with a loud voice that a report would require additional labor, Will said, "Well, find another clerk to visit the yard. Even a carpenter can make a mark for each piece completed, and please, control yourself, sir." Will and Lord BraitheWaite decided they would force Frost to provide documentation besides the normal monthly reports. This would aggravate Frost and help them spot the discrepancies, thereby eliminating the theft. "I will expect the first report tomorrow at my office," and handed him a card with the address of his office. Frost turned purple. "That's impossible. I can hardly find a clerk so quickly." "Well then, do the job yourself until you find someone capable." Pulling his lace-edged handkerchief from his sleeve, flicked a non-existent piece of lint from his silk jacket and walked from the room. Lord BraitheWaite explained to Will during their last meeting that angry men were often more careless. So, Will was trying to make Frost as angry as possible by insulting his position in the company. Daniels came into Frost's office and said, "That Popinjay has gone off in his carriage again, and good riddance, I say." "Shut the door and sit down, Daniels. I want you to get hold of some boys." "I can get the same ones we used on the last little job. I'll set it up for tomorrow night when he arrives home. They'll grab him, pop him on the head, row him out, and let him swim with the fish for a bit." And Daniels laughed. "Good, I want that peacock so-and-so plucked like a Christmas goose. Tell the boys to smack him around a bit first, then float him." Frost snarled. The next morning, when Will came down the stairs, Joe and Stan were once again sitting at the kitchen table eating a hearty breakfast. "Anything happened last night? Any traffic?" A wagon full of what looked to be finished boat ribs with an X on each piece left the yard a bit before midnight. We followed the wagon to a house about a mile from the yard and watched it unload inside a high fence. I set my kid brother up a tree to watch and see what happened. He told us this morning that about an hour later another wagon came to the house. 2 men loaded up them boat's ribs and drove it to another shipyard about 2 miles down, Simpson's it was. Joe said, "Will paid them for the 2 nights' work and said to continue watching." "Joe, did you talk with your mother about the inside man we need?" "She's a-thinkin' on that one. We don't know too many people in the trades. She says she will have you a man to mind soon." Tearing off a large chunk of the fresh bread, Joe and Stan went home to bed. Will visited the yard that morning, and when Daniel saw him enter the yard, came toward him at a good pace. then hesitated and headed for the office. Will walked into the small yard office just as Daniels was storing something in a box. Will decided he and Mei Li would return that evening after everyone was gone. He wanted to find out what it was that Daniels was hiding and do a general search of the office. Daniels took a seat behind the desk to cover his movements. Will ignored what had happened as if he had seen nothing and said, "Daniels, I've come to see if my requests of yesterday were carried out." "Surely, sir, you did not really mean for Mr. Frost." Will waved away his objection. "I do mean to have the reports today. I have my position to protect, so you tell Frost I will have them today if he is to maintain his employment with this firm." Will turned up his nose and strode from the office. Daniels jumped up and came out after him as Will strolled the yard, touching and examining the worked lumber, the futtocks of the day before they were gone. He saw a carpenter marking a large black X on a pair of what looked to be finished knee heads and asked Daniels the significance of the marks. "Oh, those are pieces rejected by the master shipwright." Will acted as if he could care less and walked on a bit and said, "Who is our supplier of rough timbers?" "I don't know, sir. You'd have to ask Frost." We'll spend a long day arguing with Daniels and Frost, pushing and causing them as much aggravation as possible. He decided he would walk for a while to stretch his legs and maybe lose some of his tension. The truth be told, he missed practicing the dances with Mei Li. So, he dismissed the carriage just out of sight of the company offices and relaxed, looking around at the beautiful day. Will was within sight of the house when a large bald man with rusty-colored skin stepped into his path and pointed a knife at him. Will put on his best smile and said in a loud voice, "Hey Dave, how's your mum?" He stepped forward with his hand outstretched like he was going to shake hands with this guy. The guy froze, his jaw dropped, and a stupid look took over his face. He couldn't wrap his pea-sized brain around the question about his mum coming from a man he was sent to abduct and feed to the fish. Will's outstretched hand turned from a handshake into a tiger claw as he thrust his fingertips upward into the eyes of his first attacker. He knew there would be two or more and must disable this man as fast as possible if he was to survive. The man leaned away to protect his eyes. Will stepped forward with a stomp kick to the man's leg. The leg broke with a loud snap, like the sound of a large tree limb breaking. The man screamed and fell to the ground. Will stepped over him and ran forward a few paces to give him a few seconds to see the situation and some space to maneuver. He turned just as the second attacker followed him over his fallen comrade and swung a belaying pin at his head. Will stepped toward the man and to his right outside the arc of the swing, rather than backing away as his attacker had expected. Will brushed the club to the side with his left hand, grabbed his wrist with his right, and punched the man hard in the face with his left. Will put the man into a forearm lock and threw the man head over heels into the oncoming third attacker. Both men fell hard to the ground. Will stepped forward and kicked each man in the face as they tried to rise from the ground, putting them both down for a short nap. He then stepped back to the bald man with the broken leg, picked up his dirk and put it within an inch of the man's right eye and said, "Tell me, or you will be blind as well as crippled. Who sent you?" Will saw real fear, and the man answered, "Daniels." "Well, that was a refreshing spot of exercise. It should improve my appetite this evening." Will stood, straightened his peacock clothes, smiled, and continued his stroll home. Later that night, Will and Mei Li, dressed in black, easily opened the locked main door using lock-picking tools Will had fashioned for the job. Entering the yard, a quick inspection of the locks on his earlier visit had provided him with the knowledge of what would be required. They were in the small yard manager's office for very little time. Will went straight to the box and lifted the lid. Inside was a second framing model. Will pulled it from the box and sat it next to the framing model that already sat on the desk. Will recognized the one on the desk as the framing model for the two contract ships for the Admiralty. He knew it well after spending weeks crafting the complete working model from which this one was taken. The two models were not quite identical, and Will could tell the one from the box was for a slightly smaller ship. He carefully replaced the model in the box and returned it to its prior position on the small shelf. "Look at these," Mei Li said in a low voice and produced several sets of plans. Will noted the names of the ships in his little leather-bound book, including the tonnage and dimensions of each vessel. They returned the plans to their original site and then closed and locked the office doors. Outside, they locked the gate and walked quietly away. Moving quietly over to the back of a wagon where they knew Joe and Stan were watching, they found the two men fast asleep. Will shook Joe awake. "Sleeping on the job is treason and you could be shot. This is a contract for the king." "Sorry, Gov, it won't happen again, I promise. What are you doing here at this hour?" "Checking up to see what my copper is buying, of course, and it looks as if I am being cheated." Joe looked sheepish. "Honest, sir, we can hear anything that happens. We promise not to miss any wagons. They make lots of noise, them horses do." "Keep your eyes open, I will see you at breakfast," Will said and departed. As he expected, Joe and Stan had nothing to report. All had been quiet for the rest of the night, and after a hearty breakfast they retired to their beds. But Joe did say, "Ma's found you a man for the inside. Good worker and knows the trades. She's sending him here tonight, if that be all right." "Have the man come for dinner tonight at 8. I promise at least a good meal." That night John Marks came to dinner. Upon entering the house he seemed quite nervous, but accepted a beer and a seat at the table, and was soon in an animated discussion of his trade as a carpenter. Marks, like Will's grandfather, had trained as a wheelwright. When Will told him so, the man was visibly relieved to find he was with another tradesman and not the grand gentleman he thought Will, in his fine clothes, to be. Will swore him to secrecy, and the man said he knew how to keep things to himself and promised a good day's work for his pay. "Mr. Marks, do you have a letter from your last employer to present to the company?" "I was down with a fever last year and couldn't work, but I'm fit now and need to work. I fear, sir, that I don't have a proper letter, though. I had a bit of a row with Simpson over me wages due when I came down with the influenza. My Molly went to pick up me wages and they told her to go to blazes, that I would not receive a farthing because I had abandoned my position. So, when I was well enough to leave my bed, I had words with the man. It weren't true, sir. He left me and my children to starve. He ain't a honest man, sir." Will told Marks that if he would be his inside man, he would make certain Marks had a position for life and a bonus. Will stood and extended his hand. "I'll see what I can do to obtain you a proper letter." Marks smiled widely as they shook hands. John Marks was a happy man and went home to tell his wife he had a job. Will, after a discussion with May Lee, wrote up the report of the day along with the past week's events that had already been noted in his book and went to bed. Along with the week's report, he sent a letter requesting his lordship to find someone other than himself to send a letter to get Marks a carpenter's position in the company yard. He explained that if he or his lordship supplied the letter, they would be suspicious of Marks at the outset. He didn't wish Marks to be watched, so it would be better if the letter came from another source. Will sealed the dispatch box he used for the purpose of communications and went to the livery the next morning and hired a writer. Will sent the report and letter to his father's shop. That way, if anyone were nosing about the correspondence, would seem less suspicious. The next day, Will received the dispatch box sealed with his father's seal. Inside was a letter composed by and signed by a friend of Lord BraitheWaite to help Marks gain the position as carpenter. Also inside was a bag of copper coin and a short note to Will. Will penned a quick note and called Edward in and said, "Edward, I need you to carry a message to Marks. He has rooms back of the old church on West Street. Tell him to come as quickly as possible. Go, quick." Within an hour, Marks was sitting with letter in hand with instruction to go straight away to the yard and apply for work. "We've no time to waste if we are to set things straight in the company. The job will require some additional work in the evenings. I know you can't read or write, but I wish you to learn some basics. I wish you to keep count of production by as many of the other carpenters as you can. Take care not to be noticed doing so. We don't wish you discovered." Marks looked at Will in amazement and said, "You will teach me to read and write, sir, like a rich man." "If you wish and will study hard, it will not be easy. Edward here is learning." Edward stood proud and tall. Well, as tall as possible anyway, with his huge smile on his small face. After Marks left for the yard to seek a carpenter's position, Will sat down with May Lee and they began to work out lessons for Mark, so he would be able to record the information they required for Lord BraitheWaite. They would need him to be able to recognize certain things and keep track of production. They would teach the specifics of the job first instead of a general education in reading and sums like the children. Will finished dressing as the peacock and went to the office to harass Frost a bit. That evening after dinner, Marks arrived with the good news. He would start work in the morning and was told to come in for his first reading lesson. So, they had a new student around the kitchen table. Marks was at first confused, but little New Lynn held his calloused hand and began to help him work through the lesson Mei Lee had prepared. He was given a lead pencil and some paper to practice on and soon was counting and making marks to match. Little New Lynn was happy because she was now a teacher and her pupil was doing very well for only one lesson. So, for the next fortnight, evenings were pretty much the same. Marks would arrive, turn his count over to Will, sit next to New Lynn and Edward, and work on the lesson prepared for him by Mei Lee. One day, a summons came for Will to come to the farm. Lord BraitheWaite sent a note saying he now had enough information to approach the magistrate. Will had to agree with the counts from Marks to go along with the notes on the shipment of Ridgex to Simpson's shipyard reported by Joe and Stan. They had a pretty good picture of what was happening to Lord BraitheWaite's profits. Will, Mei Lee, Edward and New Lynn packed up, boarded the carriage, and drove toward home. Just outside of town, Will had the driver stop at a tavern where he went in for a quick beer and changed his clothes. He returned in just a few minutes in his own lightweight cotton clothing. He jumped back into the carriage, feeling much more himself. The next day, Will arrived at the farm of Lord BraitheWaite and was ushered into his lordship's office by the bulldog. With Lord BraitheWaite were several other gentlemen who were introduced as the magistrate and Lord Burns from the Admiralty. They were discussing the situation at hand. While they didn't wish to disrupt the building of His Majesty's ships, something was going to have to be done to rid themselves of the corruption in the company. The magistrate felt the reports signed by Daniels and Frost demanded by and delivered daily to Will, when compared with the other reports, would provide evidence enough for a lengthy prison stay for those two. He also said a suit must be pressed against Simpson. All Simpson has to do is deny Frost and Daniels and say he bought the worked lumber in good faith. Lord Burns said, Lord BraitheWaite's accountant, once he had seen the pattern, traced back 3 years and found there had been a gradual increase in costs. The company had been paying extra labor and materials to produce almost 4 ships to each one that was on the books. It was a large sum of money, even to his lordship's standard, by Will's reckoning. Will went home that night feeling like a free man, not because he had finished the job, but because he no longer had to wear the peacock clothes. He spent a joyful evening with his family and their new additions. A few days later, he received a letter from Lord BraitheWaite. He, his primary accountsman, and the magistrate paid a surprise visit to the Bristol office. He had demanded the locked box, opened it, and examined the records. A thorough search of Frost's office had found a second set of books, enough for the coup de grace. Frost and Daniels had been arrested and would be replaced. Will was happy to hear that Marks was to be trained to take Daniels' position and receive some gold as a reward for services. Will saw to it that Marks would continue to be tutored to read, write, and do sums. When Marks asked why he was so generous when most men were so stingy and mean, a man who can read and write and do proper sums is a more valuable employee, Will said, and left it at that. The letter arrived with an additional £10 sterling in small gold coins to be distributed to everyone who helped in the situation as a reward. Edward and New Lynn each received a gold coin, their first ever. They reacted as if they had been given the Bank of England. Edward asked Mei Lee to sew him a pocket in his nightshirt so he could keep it with him. Mei Lee took a nail and punched a hole through the coin, put it onto a leather thong, and placed it over his head. He picked the gold coin up and stared down at his great fortune. New Lynn made herself a small purse with a cord she could attach to her waist. Even Joe and Stan's mother got a gold coin for her purse for finding Marks, who turned out to be a real diamond in the rough. Thank you for spending this time with us today. We hope you enjoyed the story and the journey our characters are taking. Please remember to like, subscribe, share, and tap the notification bell so you don't miss the next episode. Your support means everything, and we look forward to having you back with us for the next chapter